and a guy named Jeff Rayner, who spoke to me and said, "I can change your image," he said.
Something just broke open, and once you hear it, there is absolutely no going back. 3 people, 3 separate relationships, 3 completely different histories with Meghan Markle, and somehow, they are all telling the exact same story.
At liberty to discuss the details of that, but they did respectfully for both of them.
Not in a fight, not in a dramatic fallout, but piece by piece, interaction by interaction, until there was almost nothing left. Thomas Markle, Doria Ragland, Samantha Markle. They didn't coordinate this. They don't share an agenda. They came at this from completely different angles. And yet the story they're each telling, the one they've been sitting on for years, points to the exact same conclusion. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is not tabloid noise. This is not speculation. These are the 3 people on Earth who knew Meghan before the world did. And they are done staying quiet. The father who kept calling. Let's start with Thomas Markle, because his story is the one that sets the foundation for everything else. Now, most people have a version of Thomas in their heads. The father who staged paparazzi photos before the royal wedding. The man who kept giving interviews when he probably should have stopped. The embarrassing figure the press loved to ridicule. That's the version that was built for public consumption. That's the version that served a very specific narrative. But here's the question nobody was really asking. Why was Thomas talking to the press in the first place? Think about that. This is a man who, by his own account, spent years trying to reach his daughter through every normal channel available to him. Phone calls, messages, direct attempts to make contact. And what did he get back? Silence. Not anger, not arguments, not even a firm, "leave me alone." Just silence. Can you imagine that? You are a father. You watched your daughter grow up. You were there for the small, unglamorous years, the school pickups, the difficult teenage phases, the private moments that never made it into any biography. You know this person. And then one day, somehow, you find yourself having to navigate a system of intermediaries and scheduled windows just to attempt a conversation with her. That's not distance. That's architecture. Someone built that. Thomas kept pointing to this. Not with explosive rage, not with the kind of venom you'd expect from someone who felt genuinely betrayed, but with this quiet, persistent confusion. The kind that comes from someone who has replayed every moment looking for the turn, looking for the exact point where something broke, and keeps coming up empty. He wasn't just saying Meghan changed. Plenty of people change when fame enters the picture. That's not surprising. What Thomas was saying was something far more specific and far more unsettling. He was saying that the version of Meghan the world fell in love with, the warm, open, emotionally available woman who spoke so movingly about family and gratitude and connection, and the version he was experiencing existed in completely separate realities. The world got one, he got the other, and the world's version looked nothing like his. Now pause and ask yourself something. How many times did you watch Meghan in an interview and feel genuinely moved? How many times did she say something about her family, about the people who shaped her, and you thought, yes, she's real, she's genuine, this is someone who actually means what she says? If your answer is more than once, you were looking at a performance. According to Thomas, the closeness being projected outward, the gratitude, the family loyalty, it was a story, a carefully maintained story. And the man who raised her was standing on the wrong side of it. What makes this particularly hard to sit with is the contradiction at the center of it. Here is a woman who gave interviews about the importance of family, who spoke about the people who raised her with apparent tenderness, who projected an image of someone deeply rooted, deeply connected, deeply aware of where she came from. And here is her father, sitting at home, unable to get a phone call through. That gap, that specific enormous gap between the public image and the private reality, is what Thomas has been carrying for years. And it's important to understand something. He is not describing this as bitterness. He is describing it as a burden. The burden of watching the world believe something he knows wasn't true, while being completely unable to do anything about it. Because what can you do? If you speak out, you're the unstable father causing drama. If you stay quiet, the false version cements itself further. There is no clean exit from that position. Thomas was trapped in it for years. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. At some point, Thomas says he reached a place where he had to ask permission just to speak to her, his own daughter, a man who paid for her private education, who was there from the very beginning, who gave up parts of his own life to support hers, reduced to requesting access, through other people, on a schedule, like a visitor applying to see someone in a controlled environment. That is not a natural byproduct of fame. That is a system. And systems like that don't build themselves. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to genuinely sit with this before you scroll to the comments. Have you ever been on the receiving end of managed silence? Not a screaming argument, not a door slammed in your face, but that particular brand of quiet that tells you more than any fight ever could. The kind where you pick up the phone, you start to dial, and then something in you already knows before you even press call that it's going to go nowhere? Thomas Markle lived in that silence for years. Not days, not months, years. And what makes it uniquely painful in his case is the visibility of it. Because while Thomas was sitting in that silence, while his calls were going unanswered and his messages were disappearing into a void, the rest of the world was watching something completely different. They were watching a public figure give interviews about the importance of family, about gratitude, about the people who shaped her. They were watching moments that suggested warmth and rootedness and genuine human connection. And none of that, not a single frame of it, reflected what Thomas was experiencing from his side of the story. That's not just painful. That's a particular kind of gaslighting that operates entirely in public, where the person who can't reach their family member has to watch the world celebrate that same family member for being so open, so real, so deeply connected to the people who raised her, while sitting alone with the knowledge that the phone hasn't rung in months. The mother who had to book a call. If Thomas's story makes you frustrated, Doria's is the one that makes you go completely quiet. Because there is something about a mother's account that operates on a different level entirely. Thomas is the father. His pain is real and it matters. But Doria is the woman who carried her, who shaped who Meghan became in the earliest, most fundamental years. The bond between a mother and child is not a relationship you choose. It is the most elemental connection a human being has. And if what Doria is now saying is true, that bond was slowly, methodically, and deliberately managed out of existence. Let that sink in. The world's image of Doria was beautiful. This composed, graceful, quietly dignified woman who stood behind her daughter at some of the most significant moments of her life. Always present, always supportive, always radiating the kind of unconditional love that doesn't need to announce itself. People responded to Doria in a profound way because she seemed to represent something real in an environment that often felt constructed. She was Meghan's anchor, the quiet proof that underneath the titles and the ceremonies and the carefully managed public appearances, there was a real woman with a real mother who loved her. That was the story being told. And people believed it. Because why wouldn't they? Here's why. Because Doria says the connection everyone assumed existed between them was a lot more complicated than anything that was being shown. The easy natural closeness, the kind you'd expect from a mother and daughter who had been through everything together, wasn't always what was happening in private. Behind those carefully captured photographs, behind the appearances that looked so warm and real, she describes a relationship that had slowly become something much more formal, much more managed. Visits didn't just become less frequent, they became scheduled. Not in the normal way families sometimes plan ahead when life is busy. Scheduled the way a professional meeting gets put in a calendar, structured, arranged, timed. And the phone calls? Getting her own daughter on the phone wasn't something Doria could just do. She had to book it. Let that sit for a moment. A mother, having to book time, with her own child, not because of distance or time zones or logistical complications, but because access had become something that was controlled, managed, allocated, and the person controlling and managing and allocating it had apparently decided that the amounts available to the woman who raised her were going to be limited. Now here's the question you need to ask yourself, and I want you to genuinely think about this. Every public moment you witnessed between Meghan and Doria, the ones that looked warm and natural and full of genuine affection, what were those moments actually showing you? If Doria had to book a call to reach her daughter, if visits required scheduling like professional appointments, what was the actual relationship that existed beneath those images? Doria talks about interactions that seemed to only happen when there was a reason for them. A public-facing event, a photo opportunity, a moment that required the presence of a supportive, loving mother in the frame. And in those moments, yes, the warmth was there. The smiles looked real enough. The body language suggested connection. But the moment it was over, the moment the cameras weren't pointing their way, the dynamic shifted. The closeness that had just been on display didn't carry into the next conversation, the next visit, the next quiet moment at home. What Doria is really describing, and this is the part that is genuinely hard to hear, is the feeling of being used as a set piece. Not deliberately cruel, maybe. Not with malice aforethought, but functionally. Present when the image required it, less accessible when it didn't. For a woman who gave everything she had to raising her daughter, who stood by her through every stage of her life, that feeling of only being needed for appearances carries a specific kind of hurt that is almost impossible to articulate. Doria doesn't describe it with anger. It's quieter than that. It's the account of someone who loves her daughter deeply and has had to slowly come to terms with the fact that love alone was not enough to keep that door open. Somewhere along the way, access to her own child became something that had to be earned, managed, carefully timed. And the woman who once knew everything about her daughter now sometimes felt like a guest in her life, welcomed when the occasion called for it, quietly sidelined when it didn't. But here's where Doria's account takes a turn that makes everything significantly darker. Because she didn't just describe her own experience of being sidelined. She started hinting at something more intentional. Something that went beyond a busy daughter losing touch with her family. She hinted that Thomas's attempts to get through, his calls, his messages, his genuine efforts to maintain some kind of connection with his daughter, those efforts were reportedly not just falling on deaf ears by accident. They were being redirected, quietly, consistently, in a way that made sure the distance stayed exactly where it was. Do you understand what that means? This shifts the story entirely. It's no longer about a woman who got overwhelmed by fame and gradually drifted from her family. That happens. People understand that. What Doria is describing is something more deliberate. A pattern. A set of choices that kept specific people at a specific distance and made sure they stayed there. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. The way the most effective systems of control always operate, so gradually and so smoothly that by the time you recognize it as a pattern, the distance has already been established and normalized. The sister who watched it all happen. Now we come to Samantha. And Samantha's account is different from Thomas's and Doria's in one very important way. She brings specificity. Thomas describes hurt and confusion. Doria describes loss and a slow erosion of closeness. But Samantha describes a system, a way of operating, and once she lays it out, the full picture comes into focus in a way it simply couldn't before. They grew up together. They shared a home, shared memories, shared the kind of history that is supposed to be unbreakable. The inside jokes, the embarrassing moments, the quiet, ordinary days that don't make it into any highlight reel. Samantha assumed that history was permanent, that it didn't require maintenance because it was simply part of who they both were. Then the fame came, and it didn't happen overnight. That's the part Samantha keeps coming back to. It was gradual, subtle at first, invitations that started coming less frequently, conversations that got shorter, interactions that began to feel like they were being filtered somehow, like there was a layer between them that hadn't existed before, a layer that wasn't explained and wasn't acknowledged, but was unmistakably there. Slowly, the sister she grew up with started to feel like someone she had to navigate, rather than someone she could just call. At some point, even basic conversations were reportedly going through other people. Not directly, the way you'd expect between two people who shared a childhood, but routed, managed. Like access to Meghan had become something that needed to be coordinated, rather than something that just happened naturally between sisters. Now I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever had a relationship in your life where you slowly realized you were being managed? Where you started to feel like conversations had an agenda behind them? Where the easy naturalness that used to just be there had been replaced by something that felt calculated? Because if you have, even a fraction of it, you have some sense of what Samantha was dealing with. Multiply that by years. Multiply it by watching the public version of your relationship look nothing like the private one. That is what she was living. And here's what made it genuinely strange. From the outside, everything looked fine. The public version of their relationship didn't reflect any of what Samantha was experiencing. There were moments that read as affectionate, appearances that suggested closeness, the kind of interactions that, if you were watching from the outside, you'd take as genuine signs of a bond that was still very much intact. But Samantha says what you were seeing in those moments wasn't what was actually happening between them. Every gesture felt like it had been thought through, weighed. Like before anything was given, someone had already calculated what it would look like and decided it passed the test. Think about how exhausting it is to even describe that about someone you grew up with. Because it means that even the moments that looked real, the smiles, the brief interactions at events, the occasional appearances together, were coming from a place of calculation rather than genuine feeling. And when you know that, when you've experienced the off-camera version enough times to recognize the pattern, the public moments stop feeling like connection. They start feeling like something else entirely. Samantha talks about a specific feeling, the feeling of being invisible, not ignored in an obvious, dramatic way, not shut out loudly, but quietly sidelined, like she existed in Meghan's life only when it was useful for her to be there, and was otherwise kept at a comfortable remove. And unlike Thomas, who was trying to get calls through, or Doria, who was booking appointments just to talk, Samantha was dealing with something slightly different. She was dealing with the feeling of being replaced, not by another person, but by a version of herself that only showed up when the cameras were on. That might be the most specific kind of hurt in this entire story. Because it's not just about being shut out. It's about watching someone construct a version of your relationship for public consumption, while knowing that the real version, the one that exists off-camera, looks nothing like it. It's about being close enough to see the gap, but far enough away that you can't do anything about it. But Samantha didn't stop at describing how things felt. She went further. And the further she went, the more the picture she painted stopped looking like a story about family drift and started looking like something with deliberate intention behind it. She describes family interactions that weren't just occasionally staged. They were thought out, strategically assembled, like each one had a job to do before it ever happened. Think about what that actually looks like in practice. It's not just showing up to a public event and smiling for cameras. Most public figures do that to some degree. This is something more specific. The idea that every point of contact with family was being run through a filter first. What does this interaction need to look like? What does it need to achieve? And once those questions were answered, the interaction would happen. but only in the form that served those answers. And here is the part that is particularly uncomfortable. Samantha points out that even the moments with Doria, with her own mother, weren't exempt from this. The interactions the public saw between Meghan and Doria, the ones that read as natural and loving and close, were apparently timed around what they needed to accomplish publicly rather than around genuine connection. A mother and daughter appearing together, not because they had something real to share, but because the moment required them to be seen that way. Doria isn't a PR figure. She's not a celebrity. She's a mother. And the idea that even her relationship with her daughter was being managed around optics rather than actual closeness reframes almost everything people thought they were watching. The pattern that can't be dismissed. Now here is the part of this story that elevates it above personal grievance, above family drama, above the kind of thing you can dismiss as complicated relationships and he said, she said. Thomas, Doria, and Samantha are not a united front. They do not have a shared agenda. They came to this from completely different places, a father, a mother, a sister, with different relationships, different dynamics, different levels of closeness, different histories. There is no reason for all three of them to be telling the same story unless that story is true. And yet, all three describe scheduled, managed interactions replacing genuine connection. All three describe a public image that looked nothing like the private reality. All three describe a pattern of access being controlled. Phone calls that didn't get through, visits that required planning, conversations that were routed through intermediaries. All three describe the same specific feeling, that closeness was being performed for an audience while the real relationships were being kept at a functional distance. Three people, different positions, different pain, the same conclusion. When you have one person saying this, it's a perspective. When you have two, it might be a pattern. When you have three people who came to it independently, from completely different angles, all landing in the same place, that is something you cannot dismiss. That is something that demands to be taken seriously. Because here is the real question at the center of all of this. And I want you to sit with it. What is the difference between someone who becomes famous and drifts from their family and someone who actively constructs a managed distance while maintaining the appearance of closeness? One is human. One is a choice. And the consistency of what Thomas, Doria, and Samantha are describing points unmistakably toward the second thing. This isn't the story of someone who got overwhelmed and lost touch. This is the story of someone who learned how to use the tools available to her, her natural charisma, her access to the right people, her awareness of how stories get built and maintained to shape exactly what people saw and believed, while the reality behind the image looked nothing like it. The ones who ended up on the wrong side of that were the people who knew her first, the ones who had been there the longest, the ones who, by any measure, deserved the real version the most. What this really costs. Here's what nobody talks about when these stories break open. Not the headlines, not the drama, the actual human cost of it. Thomas is a father who stopped waiting for a call back. Think about what that moment looks like. The moment you stop expecting the phone to ring. The moment you stop checking to see if there's a message you missed. The moment you accept, quietly and completely, that the silence is the answer. That's not just sadness. That's a kind of grief that doesn't have a name because we don't build language for losses that technically aren't losses. The person is still alive, still out there, still visible to the world. But to you, there's only absence. Doria is a mother who learned to stop expecting spontaneity, who adjusted her entire relationship with her own child around the reality of limited, scheduled, purpose-driven access, who took all the instinctive, unplanned love a mother has for a daughter and learned to contain it within whatever windows were made available. That is an extraordinary thing to ask of someone. And the fact that Doria did it without public complaint for years says far more about her character than it does about Meghan's image. Samantha is a sister who watched herself become a footnote in a story she was supposed to be part of. Not replaced by someone else, not pushed out dramatically, just quietly written out of the narrative that was being constructed and offered to the world, sitting on the outside of something that had her name in it, but not her truth. 3 different versions of the same loss. And what makes it land harder than almost anything else is this: none of them are describing a stranger. That would be easier. If Meghan had simply become someone they didn't recognize at all, the loss would be clean. But that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that they still recognize her, they still love her, and that the person they love made choices, deliberate, consistent, sustained choices, that created a gap between herself and the people who knew her first. Not because life got overwhelming, not because fame made everything impossible, but because somewhere along the way, the version of herself being presented to the public became more important to protect than the relationships that existed before any of this started. That is not a small thing to reckon with. And it's not a thing that shows up in any headline. The question you need to answer. So here we are. A father who never stopped trying. A mother who loved without conditions. A sister who held on to history even when history stopped being returned. 3 people speaking not to tear anything down, but because the weight of carrying a private truth while watching a public fiction play out in real time eventually becomes too heavy. And some things, some real things, deserve to exist somewhere outside of one person's carefully managed image. The story that was told to the world about Meghan Markle, the one about family, about connection, about a woman deeply rooted in the people who shaped her. According to the 3 people closest to her, that story and the reality it was supposedly representing were not the same thing. They were 2 parallel realities operating simultaneously. And the world only ever got to see one of them. Before we get there, I need to acknowledge something, because if I don't, the comments will. Some of you watching this are going to push back. Some of you are going to say, these people have axes to grind. Thomas has given controversial interviews. Samantha has written a book. Doria has always been on Meghan's side publicly. So why is she now hinting at something different? Those are fair questions. Skepticism is healthy, and I'm not asking you to suspend it. What I'm asking is that you hold all of that skepticism and still grapple with the convergence. Because it's one thing to dismiss one source. It is another thing entirely to explain why 3 separate people, with different motivations and different histories and different relationships with Meghan, are all independently describing the same operational reality. That is the part that doesn't have a clean counter-argument. And that is the part that deserves your full attention. Now let's be clear about something else, because this matters. None of what Thomas, Doria, or Samantha are describing requires Meghan to be a villain. That's not the framework. People are complicated. Fame does genuinely strange things to relationships. The pressures of living an entirely public life, of having every family interaction potentially turned into a headline, of navigating palace protocols and PR machinery and global scrutiny simultaneously, those are real pressures. Nobody is pretending otherwise. But there is a difference, a very important difference, between someone whose relationship suffered because of those pressures and someone who used those pressures as cover. Someone who allowed the chaos and complexity of public life to serve as the explanation for a distance that was, according to 3 separate accounts, actively constructed and maintained. Because the pressures explain drift. They explain miscommunication. They explain relationships that become strained and awkward and difficult to maintain. What they don't explain is the scheduling system. What they don't explain is a mother having to book a call. What they don't explain is a father's calls being redirected rather than simply going unanswered. Those details don't come from being overwhelmed. Those details come from choices. And that is what makes this story matter beyond the headlines and the drama and the royal intrigue. It's not really about Meghan and the royals. It's about something much more universal than that. It's about the gap between who we present ourselves to be and who we actually are to the people standing closest to us. It's about the stories we build for the world versus the ones we live in private. And it's about what happens to the people on the wrong side of that gap. The ones who love you anyway, who keep trying anyway, who wait and schedule and book appointments just for a few minutes of something real. What you do with all of this is up to you. But here is the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely want you to think about it and answer in the comments below. When the people who knew you before the world did, your father, your mother, your sibling, when all three of them are independently telling the same story about you, what does that mean? Is there ever a version of fame, of public life, of building a narrative that justifies that distance? Is there ever a point where the image becomes more important than the people behind it? Where the story you tell the world about yourself matters more than the story the people who raised you are living in private? And here's the follow-up question, one that I think is even more important. If this were your family, if these were your parents and your sibling describing this experience, would you hear it? Would you be able to sit with the possibility that the gap between who you are publicly and who you are privately had grown that wide without you even fully realizing it? Or would the defense mechanisms kick in and make it someone else's problem? These aren't rhetorical questions. I genuinely want to know where you land. Drop it in the comments, because the people who watch this channel don't just consume stories, they think about them. And this one deserves that. Hit subscribe. Turn on the bell. Because what comes next changes the story again. The next video goes even deeper. And I promise you, you are not ready for what's in it.